Welcome to this video on the Lunar Modulation Lab by Blue Lantern. This is a hybrid designed VCO based on the discrete triangle core Buchla originated design, which was later updated to the advanced VCO by Bergfotron. This is an extremely powerful 18 HP mega VCO. It has 11 plus different waveform outputs, multiple frequency modulation inputs, 2 different switches to adjust the shape of some waveforms, easy access calibration trimmers under the big coarse tune knob here. The faceplate is the typical FR4 fiberglass based PCB panel. Fun fact about that, Blue Lantern was the first to use PCB panels as faceplates for modular synthesizers, when at the time most were just metal like this one here. Since this is a discrete triangle core based oscillator, it's extremely stable. It's stable across 10 octaves with the volt per octave tracking. This pulls waveforms from the advanced VCO by Bergfotron, plus a few added waveforms here from Blue Lantern's personal collection. And we have a switch here to go from VCO to LFO mode, which really transforms it into a powerful self-modulating LFO module with a plethora of waveform outputs. Now let's do a really quick rundown. Okay, I'm going to do a really quick rundown of everything on the module here, and then we'll go into everything with a bit more depth afterwards. First, we have 11 different outputs on here. First, we have the double saw, sine X wave, triangle wave, saw wave, even wave, pulse wave, ramp wave, stairs wave, our divider wave, and then we have the triangle curve wave and triangle curve pulse. The linear wavy switch adjusts our double saw, even, and ramp waves into a more curvy shape, and this linear curve switch adjusts these two outputs here to a more curvy shape and a different pulse width. With our divider output here, we have the selector here, which sets our divisor. Then we have our inputs. We have typical volt per octave tracking input here, and then we have another volt per octave input here with the mod input with attenuator. When the attenuator is all the way up, we get volt per octave. We have our linear frequency modulation input with attenuator. We have our FM exponential frequency modulation with attenuverter. We have a reset circuit here, which accepts triggers to reset the waveform only in VCO mode. We have a sync input with its own sync attenuator for softer or harder syncing. We have our coarse tune and fine tune knobs to really dial things in. And then we have our LFO VCO switch, which switches between an LFO and a VCO, which we could see the waveform indicated by these lights. Now let's get a little more in depth and check out these waveforms. All right, now let's look at what these oscillators sound like. I'm going to pull the pulse wave here just to have a little bit more control over the time in the oscilloscope to see what we're looking at. So I'm going to start with a double saw wave, which is, as you guessed, a double saw wave. This is a double wave, so it has that extra harmonic in there, which actually boosts its pitch up an octave in its harmonics. And we can adjust this with our linear wavy switch to 2 nice curved sawtooth waves. We have a sine wave, sine X, with its own attenuator here. It's a nice smooth sine wave. We then have the triangle wave, which is the core of the oscillator, and it's a nice clean triangle wave. We then have our saw wave, which is just 1 saw instead of the 2 like the double saw, so it doesn't have that increased harmonic. And this is also adjustable with the linear and the curve. You can see the curve has a little hump in it to give it a little bit more interest. Now we have our even wave, which is an even harmonic between the double saw and the sine waves. So you can see the sine wave and the double saw hitting in here. And this is also adjustable with the linear and wavy switch. We then have our pulse wave, which is a square wave or pulse wave with control over the pulse width. And it does not go to absolute zero, so it does not cut off in sound either way you go. Now we have the ramp wave here, which is opposite the sawtooth wave, and it ramps up instead of ramping down. And this is also adjustable by the wavy and linear switch. And this curves similar, just a mirror image of the sawtooth wave. We then have the stairs output, which is interesting. You could hear a very faint buzzing of our actual pitch here. If I zoom out here, you see it's a stepped sawtooth wave. So we could actually hit nice frequencies with this if we bring our pitch up. And we get a nice sub oscillator with this. But at the lower levels, it serves as a nice modulation source. We then have our divider pulse out, which is only positive voltage, but we can see here it will pulse at divisions of our actual oscillator. So right now it's at half, and we can go down to 4, 8, 16, and 32. So it does interesting things when we get into these higher values here. We get some nice octave pitch changes. This is adjustable with the selector input, and there is a reset input here, which will reset the wave every time it receives that trigger. Then we have the triangle curve wave here, which is from Blue Lantern's personal collection of waveforms over the years. We can see we have a nice, interesting, sawtooth, triangle-y looking, harmonic-rich wave here. And it gets more interesting when we use the curve switch here, where it turns into two opposing sine waves with some teeth in between. And then we have the triangle curve pulse, which we get an interesting harmonic rich pulse wave here. And then this actually will be affected by the curve switch. It doesn't curve it, but it adjusts our pulse width a bit. So we get a more interesting sound, a bit buzzier. And that's all the waveforms. Now that we looked at all the waveforms, let's look at the volt per octave input. Like other oscillators, it's a typical volt per octave input. There's nothing special there, except that it tracks extremely, extremely well. It tracks up to 10 octaves in the volt per octave, as I mentioned before, which is wider than a piano keyboard. Let's start with our middle C here, with 0 volts, and get this in tune. See, we're pretty close in tune here. And I'm going to drop it down 4 octaves using the Beast chalkboard here. So we can see this is inaudible, and we're still well within the realm of that C0. That's probably 2 cents off. Go up 1 octave. Now we're nearly in tune there. I mean, that's like a half a cent. Up a second one. Third, fourth, that was our in tune 0 volt. Fifth, sixth, 7, 8, and then ninth is 10 octaves up. We can see we're extremely close. This is a pitch you're never going to use. Well, challenge accepted for some people. But I mean, I think this is as high as most people would go, and this is still nicely in tune. I still need to calibrate this a touch better that we could get this near perfect. But still, it is pretty darn close in every octave that we throw it in. Meaning your notes will be in tune. Now we'll look at the linear modulation input here, which has its own attenuator knob. To show how this works here, I'm going to show also how it doesn't work. First, I'm going to turn the attenuator all the way up, and I have an offset attenuator that I have in maths that I'm using to control this linear input. So here's a sine wave. So you could hear when I turn it, the pitch changes a little bit, but it goes back when I stop turning. That's because this input is detecting the change in the values and not the values themselves. So what we need is a quicker input. So I'm pulling the LFO from Utopia here, and I'm controlling the speed of the LFO with a looping envelope from maths here. So it's just changing the speed so we could hear what it does at the different speeds. So we can hear it does less modulation, almost a vibrato type effect at the slower modulations, and then the quicker audio modulations we get nice audio frequency modulation. Now let's just listen to this fast at audio rates here. And we can hear how we get different sounding effects as we adjust our input knob here. Now we're going to look at the FM frequency modulation input, which is an exponential input, different than the linear, that we could get much higher frequency variations here. You can see in the oscilloscope I have a triangle wave coming in, which is a positive looping envelope coming from maths. And I'm using a positive voltage to best show how the FM input works. So with the FM, we have an attenuverter, not an attenuator, so it's at 0 when it is at 12 o'clock noon. So here's our base sine wave, and the thing with the attenuverter is we can never really get it at exactly 0, so if you want to do something with that, I suggest using one of the other inputs. But we can modulate in a positive direction here. When we go really slow here, get a nice siren sound. And now you can see when we go negative, it's going to give us that sub oscillator change. So if we go higher pitch, we can hear that better. Alright, now let's look at the mod input. So we have that same sine wave, and now I'm going to plug in that same looping envelope from maths into the mod input. Now when I turn the attenuator up, we get increased values here. Now this tracks at volt per octave when it is all the way up. So if you want an additional volt per octave input, you just use the mod input at full attenuation. Now what I think the mod input is great at is when you use it real subtly here, and you use it as a vibrato. We get nice interesting effects here when we change our waveform. And that's the mod input. Okay, now we're going to look at the reset input on the Lunar Modulation Lab. So we can see we just have a sine wave going into our oscilloscope right now. And I have an in-tune square wave right now just going into the time of the oscilloscope, so we could see it's actually in tune. If I put it out of tune, you could see that it starts moving. So it's at the same frequency. So now I'm going to plug this pulse output into our reset here. So we can see it is resetting our wave. You could really see what happens when I mess with the tune of this external VCO. And it cuts off our waves as soon as the pulse strikes each time. And if we get too high, we lose all of our sound. But we get interesting things when we play with both of them. We can get really interesting complex oscillator sort of sounds. And that is our reset input. Here I have a volt per octave sequence coming into the Lunar Modulation Lab and the Stopfer VCO. I have the pulse output of this VCO going into the sync of the Lunar Modulation Lab. The wave we'll be hearing is the even output, which we could see in the oscilloscope here when I open our VCA. So here's our basic sequence. And right now, the only audio we're hearing is this even wave. Ignore this triangle wave right now. So I'm going to just gently turn this sync attenuator up. We'll see how this oscillator at the same pitch affects it. It creates some interesting stepping at some points that gives it almost like a quantizer sort of feel. And it evens out to some interesting higher pitched or differently pitched waveforms in here. We get almost the houndstooth looking wave here. And then here's our full sync. Now let's hear how this sounds in conjunction with this triangle wave here coming from our basic VCO. I'm going to turn this triangle wave off again, and I'm going to just really mess with the pitch on this VCO to see what it does with our sync here. So I'm going to start with it all the way up. Now let's see what happens when we mess with our Lunar Modulation Lab pitch with the sync up. Now let's turn this noise into something more musical with some patch ideas. Okay, now let's look at some self-patching with this oscillator. I have another volt per octave sequence coming in, and we're listening to the pulse wave output going into the wasp filter for a little extra character in the sound. Here's our bass sequence. So what we're going to modulate here is the pulse width in the pulse width input from our divider circuit output. So now let's listen to our sequence, and when we push the divider button into the other divisors, it will sound a bit different. I like this one the most because it gives us a bit of a sub oscillator flavor. Now say we want to animate this divisor button here so we don't have to manually press it, but we want to still self-patch. The best output here is the stairs because it occurs less frequently, similar to the divisor, but we are reusing our divisor. It's giving us this nice, crunchy, digitized sound. So now let's build a Moog style or East Coast style patch with this. First, we'll start with a harmonic rich wave, which I think this is a great example here, this complex triangle wave. And here's a sequence with that wave. And this is running into a VCA with a typical ADSR envelope with the output controlling the VCA and the filter here, which I'm using the wasp filter. So this sounds nice and woody with the filter attacking in, but I think we want to add some low end. So I'm going to use our divider circuit out and plug that into our VCA mixer here. I have 3 inputs in my VCA. Now let's hear how that sounds. So we have a nice low end added in here. Any lower and it's going to be just kind of clicky. But here we have a nice octave down, but 2 octaves down I think works better. So now we want to round it out and give it a little bit more higher pitch harmonics. The best output to use here is our double saw because it has that harmonic at an octave up from our root note. So now we have a great bass synth here to add to any groove. Now let's take a look at creating 2 sub oscillators with this module. First, I have a general saw wave coming out. And what we're going to use for our deepest sub oscillator is actually the stairs output, which right now it's going to be rather clicky. So we can see on the oscilloscope, it's just a really slow stepped saw wave. So what we can actually do is crank our tuning up to get this into the sub levels. So now we have a nice deep stepped saw wave, a kind of digitized looking saw wave as our sub oscillator. And now for our second sub oscillator, we're going to use this divider output again. Let's put that into the mixer. So we can see this is an octave down of what our actual pitch is at here with the saw. So it's really high pitch. So we have a nice 3-octave tone here. And we have all 3 in, and we can adjust the 1. And since we're at such high pitches, even the 32 is audible here. And that's how we could get a nice deep sub using the steps and divider output.